Right now, if it started raining outside, you'd barely notice. Maybe you'd pull the blanket up an inch. That's it. That's the whole event. Now take that same rain and drop it on you 30,000 years ago, lying on open ground with nothing overhead but branches and luck. That's not a worse version of tonight. That's a different category of danger entirely. Here's the twist nobody expects. It wasn't the storm itself that killed people. It was what happened in the 2 or 3 hours after they stopped noticing the storm. After exhaustion pulled them under, and their body quietly stopped defending itself. Ancient humans didn't fear rain. They feared falling asleep in it. So before we get to fires and shelters, you need to understand the actual trap, because it's still wired into you. The trap nobody can feel happening. A cold, wet body that's awake fights back. It shivers, it moves, it complains loudly enough that you do something about it. A cold, wet body that's asleep does almost nothing. The alarm system that would normally save you gets dialed down the second, consciousness switches off, and a slow heat loss can run for hours before anything strong enough to wake a person finally fires. That's the part that should scare you. The danger wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, patient, and it worked best exactly when you were least able to notice it. Ancient humans never had a word for hypothermia, but they built an entire nightly ritual around dodging it anyway, and almost none of that ritual started with fire. It started with reading wind. Reading the wind before the rain ever arrives. Here's something almost nobody thinks about. Rain rarely falls straight down. It rides the wind sideways, and a shelter built to block water from above can still let a storm walk straight through the side. Experienced camp builders positioned sleeping areas with their backs to the prevailing wind direction, using natural windbreaks, rock faces, thick tree lines, earthen rises, as the first line of defense, long before a single branch was laid for a roof. Get the orientation wrong, and the driest-looking spot on the map turned into the wettest bed by midnight, because the wind carried the storm sideways into exactly the gap nobody thought to cover. Reading wind wasn't guesswork passed down as folklore. It was tested the hard way, night after night, by people who woke up soaked and remembered exactly which direction the water had come from. The body position, nobody talks about. Here's a detail almost nobody notices. How a person actually positioned their body while sleeping mattered almost as much as what covered them. Curling into a tight fetal position shrinks the surface area exposed to cold air and wet ground, keeping the torso, where your vital organs live, more insulated by your own limbs. Groups sleeping together took this further, arranging bodies so that the most exposed sleepers curled toward the center, and the group itself formed a kind of living windbreak, each person shielding the next from whichever direction the storm was hitting hardest that night. It wasn't just about warmth. A tightly curled sleeper loses heat slower, which means their body has more time before it crosses into that dangerous, silent slide ancient humans could never afford. Material choices. Most people get backward. So the twist here flips how you'd assume this worked. You'd think thicker meant safer. It didn't. Certain barks, birch especially, shed water almost completely because of natural waxy layers in the outer skin, while thicker, more absorbent barks soaked through and became heavier, colder, and useless within an hour. Groups who understood this stripped and stored specific barks ahead of a storm, the same way you'd keep a raincoat by the door instead of hunting for one when you're already getting drenched. And bedding worked the same way. Certain seed fluff and dried plant down, the kind that puffs up light and airy, trapped far more insulating air than packed leaves ever could, even when both looked equally dry from a distance. The people who knew the difference slept through storms. The people who didn't spent the night finding out the hard way. If a single strip of the wrong bark or the wrong handful of bedding could already be deciding your night, stay with me, because the next part is what actually kept a fire alive through all of it. And almost nobody gets this step right on the first try. Subscribe now, because the rest of this survival system only makes sense once you understand what comes next. Guarding fire. Like a second body fire in a storm wasn't about size. A roaring fire out in the open drowned in minutes. A small flame tucked into a dugout hollow or pressed against an overhang where wind and water physically couldn't reach it could burn quietly until morning. The real skill wasn't lighting it. It was starving it of exposure while still feeding it enough to survive. Angling a tiny wall of stone or packed earth around the base, leaving just enough gap for air to breathe through without letting rain find its way in sideways. Someone almost always sat close enough to protect that flame through the worst hours, because losing it didn't just mean losing warmth. It meant losing the only tool capable of drying anything out before the next storm arrived. And in a stretch of consecutive rainy nights, a fire that survived was worth more than almost anything else the group owned. Skin, feet, and the danger nobody sees coming. Here's what surprises most people. The biggest long-term threat of a rainy season wasn't any single storm. It was skin that never fully dried, especially on the feet, which carried the weight of every hunt, every gathering trip, every mile the group needed to survive. Constant dampness broke skin down slowly, opening the door to infections that could turn a healthy hunter into a liability within days. Groups rotated dry coverings for feet specifically, checking each other for the earliest signs of damage the way you'd check a smoke detector. Not because anything was wrong yet, but because catching it early was the entire point. It wasn't glamorous, it rarely gets mentioned, but it may have mattered as much as any roof. Surviving the night was only half of it. Every dry morning after a storm went straight into preparation. Drying bedding by the fire, restocking bark and fiber, checking wind-facing gaps that had let water through the night before. Skip that morning work even once, and the next storm caught you weaker than the last one. That's how a single bad night turned into a bad season, and how a bad season could quietly end a group's chances entirely. Everything you just watched, the wind-red shelter, the curled sleeping position, the right bark over the wrong one, the guarded flame, the checked feet, all of it circled back to the same three-part rule, repeated so many times it stopped being a lesson and became instinct. Why you still feel it. And that's the strange part that connects straight back to you. That restless feeling when you try to fall asleep somewhere cold or damp. The discomfort that won't let you settle until you're warm and dry. That's not random. It's an old alarm inherited whole from people who had every reason to fear the exact thing you're comfortable ignoring tonight. They had no raincoat, no thermostat, no walls that never leaked. They had wind they learned to read, bark they learned to strip, a flame someone refused to let die, and a curled, shared warmth that caught the first sign of trouble before it became the last. If even one of those choices had failed enough times, storm after storm, for thousands of years in a row, you wouldn't be here to sleep dry tonight at all. Every quiet, ordinary dry night you've ever had traces back to someone who solved the wet ones first.